Thank you for having me today, and thank you for what you all are doing. I enjoy speaking right now because I feel like there's a very good story out of the Bible that reflects how a lot of people in our country feel right now, which is the story of the spies going to the promised land. So in that story, there's 12 spies that go. The vast majority, 10 come back and say, oh, this land is filled with giants. It's doom and gloom. We look like grasshoppers in these people's sight. We're outnumbered. We should just give up. And if most people turn on the news or you look at America, sometimes you think, wow, this is kind of sad. And that's the loud majority. But the story doesn't stop there. There's 2 more spies that come and they say, hey, we saw the exact same thing that you just saw, but through a different set of eyes. And we know that God has given us in victory, and we need to go and take what God has given us. And so what I want to do today is show you something that you've probably not heard a lot about religious freedom, about the way that America works with our religious freedom laws, and walking through that, and hopefully give you some hope about what you can do in your churches in the United States as people of faith, and what our laws give you protection for. So to start, again, he said I'm Associate General Counsel. He had also mentioned that I am younger, which is true. I have a initiative that I lead at First Liberty called F3, which is the Future of Faith and Freedom. It's our initiative that we're trying to do to connect 20s to 40s to know about 20-year-olds to 40-year-olds to know about their rights, to know what they can do in their communities to stand up for their faith. So I'm leading that. But I want to start off, I know some of you may know a lot about American laws, and some of you may not be as familiar. So I want to start off with a little bit of trivia. So can anyone in here name, in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, there are 5 rights. Can anyone name all 5 or get me close without looking on Google? 5 rights in the First Amendment. Can you get me 2? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that's 2. Do you know any others? Well, I've got a pocket constitution here for you, so you can have that. And so here are the 5. Religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Petition means the right to protest. So these are the 5 rights that are in the First Amendment. And you might say, okay, well, how does religion, so we see freedom of religion, and that breaks down even farther from here, because it doesn't just say you have freedom of religion, the end. We go into freedom of religion, which comes from the clause that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are 2 clauses in there. There's the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. Establishment clause is saying, if you look back at the founding of America, the settlers were coming over from Europe because they didn't want the Church of England. They didn't want to be in a situation where the government told you this is the mandated religion, you must go to this church. So they want to make sure that there is not a national church. So that's why I say, Congress shall make no law about establishing a national church. Then the second part, it says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So they're saying we don't want anyone's religious expression restricted. So that's where a lot of your religious freedom rights come from in the country, is from the First Amendment, from this clause that breaks down into these 2 provisions. And you might say, okay, well, why is this important to know? I'm not in high school civics. Why is this important for me to know? One of our Supreme Court justices says it best, where he says, you can't fight for your rights if you don't know what they are. So to understand what your rights are, you have to know what your rights are. So it's important to know those rights, but it's important because I also want to show you some situations that very easily could happen in your church, to either you, your church, or people in your church, and of knowing what you would do in that situation. So we'll start off, and how many of you have kids? You have kids, raise your hand. Okay, let's say you have a daughter, your daughter's in school. She comes back home and says, hey, Dad, I want to start a prayer club at my school. They have a Save the Earth Green Club, they have an LGBTQ rights club, but there's no prayer club. I want to start a prayer club at my school. Then she goes and asks for the prayer club, and they say, no prayer club allowed. As the parents, you just say, okay, I guess no prayer club. I guess that's it. Or what do you do in that situation? Or let's say that you have a son, and your son, sorry, I went one too far, comes home with this book, and it's about a boy that feels like a girl on the inside, and they say, this is required reading. And you as the parent say, hey, we are people of faith. My son cannot read this book. It goes against our religious beliefs. And the school says, sorry, you have to read this book. Okay, so what do you do as the parents? Or let's say that you have someone in your church that owns their own business, and someone comes up to them and says, hey, I need you to make a gay wedding cake, or I need you to be a part of a gay wedding. And when that person says no, the state comes after them, fines them a ton of money, and bankrupts their business. So what does that business owner do? Or let's say that there's someone in your church that you want to speak on a certain issue. They're an expert in your church. You want them to come up and speak a little bit. You invite them to come up. Someone in the church records it, puts it on the internet, and then their boss says, hey, because of what you said at your church, we don't agree with you. We could fire you for what you said at your church. What do you do in that situation? Or let's say that you're a pastor, as a lot of you are, and you say, hey, God has given us the ability to keep our church open 24 hours a day, so we're going to keep our church open 24 hours a day to help the homeless. And then when you do, the city comes after you and gives you one criminal citation for 1 year in jail for 13 days for leaving your church open to house the homeless because you're not a residential facility. What do you do in that situation? And you might say, okay, well, a lot of those are extreme. Here's the last one. Let's say that you're speaking about God's view on gay marriage or on abortion. You're speaking to your people about the importance of engaging in those issues. And the IRS sends you a letter saying, hey, we need the records of what you said. We're going to investigate you. You might say, well, a lot of those things are extreme. Those things don't really happen. Well, everything I just told you about, those are all examples of cases that we've had. So those are all things that have happened. And it's important for us to be aware of when these things happen, what do we do? What's our response? What are our rights? So I want to take you through those really quick. This is the fifth grader I was referring to you about the girl that wanted to start the prayer club. This is in Seattle. She wanted to start the prayer club. They said no. Her only options at that point were to give up, to hire a $1,000 attorney to go and spend a lot of money to fight it, or to come to us. So she found us. We reached out. We sent a demand letter saying, hey, you have the right. If you have other clubs, you cannot say you can't have a prayer club. 2 months ago, she had her first prayer club, and there was over 20 students at her prayer club in Seattle. The next one, this is actually happening in California, where you had a fifth grade boy that was told he had to read this book, and then he had to read it aloud to his kindergarten buddy and ask him what color they wanted their shadow to be. And so we are involved in this, and there will be something that's going to be happening in this. But this is just a student sending their kids to school, and they were told they had to participate in this type of a book. The business owners, this is the bakers that are out of Oregon. I'll talk about them a little bit more, but they just wanted to have a cake bakery. And there was a same-sex couple that says that we wanted you to do a gay wedding cake. They said we can't do that. I'll go into detail more on that in a little bit. And then when I was talking about the churchgoer, so this is in California where Ethan Williams is an assistant principal at a school, and his pastor had asked him to get up and talk about the dangers of DEI as a person of faith. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. So saying, why is this bad for our community? Can you speak on this? Someone recorded it and sent it online. His school got a hold of it and threatened to open up an investigation into his conduct, which could mean him getting fired. Well, he's the dad of 7 kids, and his wife was a stay-at-home mom. So if he got fired from this job, he could be out in the streets with 7 kids. And he got a hold of us. We sent a demand letter to the school saying, if you open up any type of investigation for what he said in his church as a private citizen, that's against the law, and you will have a federal lawsuit the next day. Well, they backed off, and then they said, but you punish students incorrectly, so we're going to open up another investigation into your conduct of punishing students. We said, no, you can't do that. You're just trying to punish him. Sent another letter, and they just renewed his contract back in the summer, and he's going to be back at school this year. No punishments or any action taken against him. The one about the pastor, this is probably one of the craziest cases that I've ever seen us have. which is in Bryan, Ohio. It got really cold in the winter, and the homeless shelters were overflowing. And it's very cold, below freezing. And so the pastor said, my church is equipped to stay open 24 hours a day. We're not going to make this into a residential facility, but if people want to come inside to get out of the cold, we'll give them a place to come. We're going to stay open 24 hours a day. Well, the city said, hey, we need you to be a residential facility if you're going to do that. They said, we don't need to do that. We're not putting in beds. We're not doing any of that. And they said, okay, well, here's all these code violations you have in your building. You need to do this. You need to do this. And tried to work with the city. The city wouldn't work with him. So for every day that he remained open, they brought 1 count of criminal charges against him, meaning that he could go to prison for 13 years for helping the homeless in the United States. That should not happen. So we brought a lawsuit, and this is still going on, and they're still trying to bring charges, and they're trying to now evict the pastor and kick them out of their church. So this is still going on. And you might say, well, hey, Nathan, you said I was going to be feeling encouraged. I don't know how encouraged I'm feeling right now. Well, I want to show you some things that should make you feel very encouraged, which is a couple different things. Number one, we have a method of dealing with these cases that really work, which is we believe that God has equipped a lot of really good lawyers throughout the country that want to make a difference for their faith, but they're in big law firms doing big things, making a lot of money. But all these lawyers are encouraged to donate their time and do pro bono work. So if we have a case in Florida, we're going to find one of the best religious attorneys in Florida, say to them, hey, if we can help you understand this area of the law, if our in-house attorneys will explain how these cases work, and we take care of the client, we take care of the media, will you donate your time on this case and be our boots on the ground in the case? And these attorneys say, I've been waiting my entire career for this. Now I get to use my legal skills that God has given me and my love of the country and my love of my faith and combine them all together. And they're donating their time for free. So we get the best of the best that are donating their time for absolutely free. So what happens for this is a couple things. It's very cost efficient. So if we spend $1,000 on a case, we get $6,000 donated back in volunteered time from attorneys. So it's a 6-to-1 leveraging of resources financially. But then we've been doing this model for over 25 years. And in this space, you're fighting big uphill battles, big companies, government. So generally, most groups that do what we do, their win rate's about 30% a year. We've, for 25 straight years, never had a win rate less than 95%. And if you think about that, if you know much about this space, that doesn't happen. You don't win 95% of your cases even at the Supreme Court. That doesn't happen because it's very difficult to win that level of the cases. But we know that we only do this because of God's favor. No one gets to be that good without his favor. So if you know much about the Supreme Court, how the U.S. Supreme Court works, they get over 7,000 requests for cases a year. They only take about 60. So your odds of going to the Supreme Court are less than 1%. So if you say our goal is to go to the Supreme Court every year, that's a pretty big goal because your odds are less than 1% you're going to get there. So in the last 2 years, we haven't had 1 case or 2 cases at the Supreme Court, but we've had 4 cases at the Supreme Court and have won all 4 cases. And so I want to show you what these cases mean and what they mean for what rights you now have that you haven't had before. So we'll start with our first one, which is out of Maine. Maine is so rural that less than half of their school districts actually have a public school in their school district. So if you live in Maine, you may not have a public school to send your child to. So what they did is they created a voucher system where if you wanted to send your kid to a private school, to a school across state lines, online school, boys school, girls school, that's fine. And then about 10 years ago, they added in a provision that said, but you can't send them to a religiously affiliated school because then that's the government endorsing a religion. We got involved and we filed a lawsuit and we said, hey, this isn't the government endorsing religion. This is the government punishing parents and not allowing parents to choose where to send their kids to school. Because the government isn't mandating your kid goes to a Christian school. They're just saying you can't send your kid to a Christian school. So all you're doing is discriminating against religious schools. Supreme Court agreed with us 6-3 and said, hey, if any state decides to have school choice programs, you can't discriminate against religiously affiliated schools going forward. So what this means is that going forward, if Texas ever adds a school choice program, or if you live in somewhere that has a school choice program, and your church even starts a school, those students can receive state funding without any kind of strings being attached to what's being taught at that time. So it's really big for private schools, Christian schools, and all that moving forward. But what a lot of people don't realize is behind this, if you say, what is a voucher program? It's a government grant, government-funded program. So where else is government funding available for? Government funding is also available for homelessness, for men's shelters, women's shelters, drug and alcohol. And so what's been happening is there's been churches and nonprofits that have said, hey, there's state money that's available for homeless ministries. We have a homeless ministry. Can we get that money? And the state says, no, you're a church or you're a ministry. We can't give you that money. What this case does is it now says that churches, nonprofits, ministries can now ask for government funding if it's available, and the government cannot deny that funding based on the ability of that church to be related to something spiritual or to something religious. So it now opens up hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to churches, nonprofits, ministries that want to have homeless shelters, women's shelters, drug and alcohol shelters. So it opens up a lot of money for those types of churches that hasn't been available before. The next case, this is a missionary that comes back from overseas, and he says, God has told me I should not work on the Sabbath, so where should I work? The post office, right? If you know much about the United States Post Office, they don't deliver on Sundays. But Amazon delivers on Sundays, and Amazon contracted with post offices to say, you need to deliver on Sundays. So this post office worker says, hey, I can't do that. It goes against my faith. And they said, you have to work Sundays. So he transferred branches to a whole new branch, started all at the bottom of the pole again, restarted his career so that he could not work on Sundays. And then that branch enters into a deal with Amazon. And now he has to work on Sundays again. He says, I can't do it. He's punished 9 times. He's told that he's an inconvenience, that they could fire him at any time. They threaten him all the time. And then before punishment number 10, he leaves because he knows he's about to be fired and doesn't want that firing on his record, so he leaves. We then file a lawsuit because under federal law, under U.S. law, every employee has the right, if you have 15 or more employees, to ask for religious accommodation if there's something that goes against your faith. And the employer has to grant that accommodation as long as it is not a substantial burden on the employer. So you hear that and you think substantial burden, that means it's a very big bar. That's good, that protects people of faith. Well, about 50 years ago, there was a case that decided to say, hey, substantial burden, that really means slight inconvenience. So they rewrote the entire law to say, now all an employer has to do is prove it's a slight inconvenience for them to take your accommodation, and they can say no. So it's been very harmful for people in the workplace. So we get back to this case and we kind of ask the Supreme Court to do something bold, which is we say, hey, Supreme Court, we need you to admit that you were wrong, and we need you to fix your mistake. That's a pretty big ask to ask a court to do, and this court's very divided. But they came back 9-0 and said, the law is wrong, we made a mistake, we're gonna fix it. And now the law is back at substantial burden. So if you're an employee and someone asks you to do something against your faith, you have the right to ask for that accommodation. And now it has to be a substantial burden on the employer to say no. So this is very big, not only for this post office worker who's willing to work weekends, willing to work nights and double shifts, just would not work Sundays. Now the post office has to prove that that's a substantial burden, not letting him work on Sundays. That's going to be tough to prove. But also for everyday people in the workplace, it's going to mean that if someone is asked to call someone by their pronouns, that you can say, I can't do that because of my religious beliefs. I need to be accommodated. And now the burden's going to be on the employer to prove that that's a substantial burden on them. So this is really big for people in the workplace and what that means. And then the case that I mentioned earlier, the bakers, they had a bakery in Oregon. When a same-sex couple came in and says, we want a wedding cake, they said, hey, we can't do that because it's a custom work of art. And that's us engaging in your wedding, and we believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's how God has ordained it. And Oregon gave them the largest civil fine that they've given out in the history of Oregon, $150,000. Bankrupted their business, and then said, you are not allowed to speak publicly on your views on marriage. So imagine that, the government telling you what you can and can't say in public. That's not something that you can do here. So we got involved, Got that thrown out, the speech part. And this case has been going on now for over 10 years of just some bakers that didn't want to have to be forced to participate in this wedding. Gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, all the way back down a couple different times because the Supreme Court has said, hey, there's other cases that you might want to look at. You're getting this wrong. We want you to try to fix it. We just went back to Oregon for the third time and tried to get them to do it, to make the right decision. So now we're waiting to see what they're going to do. But this case, if they don't agree with us again, we could go back to the Supreme Court for a third time in this case, just for these bakers. And then the case that you might have seen somewhere, if you've seen one of our cases, is the coach out of Washington who was fired for praying after football games. So to give you some more background on his story, so he grew up in a tough family. He didn't really have a father figure, ran away from home a lot, and then joined the military, got his life together, found Jesus, and decided to get his life right, found his wife. And one day he's on a run in his community, and the athletic director comes up to him and says, hey, have you ever thought about being a volunteer football coach? And he said, I don't really know anything about football. I never played it. I don't watch it. I don't know the rules. But if this is a way for me to give back to young men, maybe this is something I should consider. So he goes and says, God, if you want me to do this, give me a sign. So he turns on TV, and what's on TV? Facing the Giants, which is a Christian movie about a Christian football coach. So he goes, okay, I think this is my sign. So in the movie, the coach takes a knee, he says a prayer on the 50-yard line, and Coach Kennedy says, as to honor God, I'm going to do this after every game. Does it for over 5 years, no issues. After one of the games, they go up to the other coach, goes to the superintendent and says, hey, this is so cool that your coach does this. The school says, we didn't know our coach was doing that. They then go to the coach and tell him, hey, you need to go inside into the locker room to pray or into a closet to pray, but no one can see you pray. They can't see you pray. He says, I can't do that. I made a promise to God. I have to do this. Going into one of his last games, he goes after the fight, during the fight song, so his kids are busy. He goes and he takes his knee and he starts praying, and he feels hands on his shoulders, and he goes, oh no, it's my kids. They left the fight song. Well, it's not his kids. It's the other coaches and their team that knew what was happening and came around him and prayed with him for his last game. So if you see pictures of Coach Kennedy with students and coaches praying with him, you're seeing the other team praying with him at one of his last games. So this then started a 7-year legal battle, going all the way up to Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, hey, we need some more facts. Try it again. And we went all the way back up to the Supreme Court. And at the appellate court, one of the judges said, hey, maybe Coach Kennedy should go read his Bible, and where it says in the Sermon on the Mount not to have lofty prayers. They said that in the opinion. So then we go to the Supreme Court, and this is the first time in the history of the United States that we've had a case that deals with what are the rights of teachers and coaches to display their faith. And the Supreme Court said, hey, the game is over here. Coach Kennedy isn't stopping the game to pray. The game is over. Other coaches are talking to their wives. They're texting on their phones. So when your official duties as a coach are done, you have the right to display your faith however you want to. And it doesn't matter if you're a football coach or if you work for a school. You have the right to that expression. So 6-3, the court ruled Coach Kennedy wins. So it's very big for coaches and for teachers all across the country. But it doesn't stop there, because if you break that down, there's a decision that's really harmful in our history called the Lemon case. The Lemon case was a case that basically said, hey, who in here has heard the term separation of church and state? You've heard that term before. Okay, well, that's not in the Constitution. It's not found anywhere. It's in a private letter from Thomas Jefferson saying that we don't want the church to become the Church of England. We don't want the government interfering with our church. Does not mean we don't want the church interfering in government. Just means we don't want the government interfering with church. So the Lemon decision was these judges that said, hey, we like the separation of church and state idea, but we want this to be in law. So we're going to create a new judicial law that says anytime that church and state touch, we're going to be very strict on this. We're going to be very tough on it. And we're going to allow people to sue the government if they're upset with 10 Commandments monuments, nativity scenes, religious displays on government property. So we had a case in 2019 called the Bladensburg Cross case, where it was a cross for fallen soldiers in World War I in Bladensburg, Maryland. And the government needs to expand the highway, the road, and so they built around it. Well, then an atheist drives by it and says, I'm offended by the cross, take it down. So they asked to take it down, and the big deal about this is the largest military cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery, is located in the same area as this. So if you have to take down this cross, you have to take down hundreds of thousands of crosses in Arlington National Cemetery. So it would have been a big deal. They said 7-2, the cross gets to stand. 7 judges said the cross is okay. But 5-4, they said, hey, the only reason we're here today is because of this Lemon decision. We don't like this decision. We're choosing not to follow it today. So we say, okay, that's a pretty big deal. So we go back to the Coach Kennedy decision, and we say, okay, so should we ask them to get rid of Lemon once and for all? Should we just say, hey, Lemon now needs to be done? And we say, no, this is such an important case that we don't want to distract the judges away from the case. We just need to get the win here, and we'll work on Lemon another time. But the judges decided to talk about Lemon for us. So in the arguments, they say, hey, didn't we say we don't like Lemon? This is the only reason we're here today is because this is a touching of government and religion. Why are we here? So they come back and they say 6-3 Coach Kennedy wins, but they also say 6-3, Lemon is no longer good law. It is done. So what that means is the new test is now not strict scrutiny of religious freedom and government. It's now, what did our founders intend? Which if you look back at the First Amendment, it means the most religious freedom we can have possible in the United States. So I tell people this, and it's hard to understand and believe, but you have more religious freedom today than you've ever had in your lifetime because of this case. That's how big this case is. It's very big and it's very important, and we're already seeing it play out all across the country, where, for example, there's a football coach for Auburn University that's at Auburn. They decided that they needed a revival night because students were talking about suicide. And there are thousands of students that show up, and one of the students says, hey, I want to be baptized. And a bunch of other students say, I want to be baptized too. So they leave the church and they go down to the river and they start getting baptized. Well, one of the students turns around and sees Coach Freeze there, and he says, hey, I'm a football player, Coach Freeze, will you baptize me? And he says, absolutely, I will, that's great. He baptizes him. You would think that would be the end of the story. But then what happens is a group hears about it, and they send a letter to Auburn, and they say, hey, he's a public coach. You can't allow him to baptize people. He needs to be punished. We send a letter, and we say, hey, Auburn, you might want to know about this Coach Kennedy case where this exact type of thing happened. Coach Kennedy had the right to do it. Coach Freeze had the right to do it. You cannot punish him for this. Auburn then says, hey, we are standing behind our coach. There will be no punishment taken. The governor of Alabama comes in and says, we stand behind Coach Freeze. There will be no punishment taken. And this is because of the Coach Kennedy case and how big that case is. And we're seeing all kinds of momentum of ground being taken that we can say, hey, we've been on the defense for so long as people of faith. We now want to go back and take the rights that the United States has to offer. One of those rights that you've seen is the kind of the fear of talking about politics in the church. So raising your hands if you believe this, who here would say, as a church, I need to register my church as a 501c3 with the IRS? If you believe that statement, raise your hand. Okay, so in the IRS code, they actually say all churches as a matter of law are tax exempt. You do not have to get a 501c3 status with the IRS. What that means is the IRS cannot tell your church what it can and cannot say because you do not fall under IRS guidelines. So that means that the fear, I'm going to guess how many of you have heard the fear of, if I talk about politics, I could lose my tax exempt status. How many of has that been a fear for you at any point? Losing your tax exempt status. For a lot of people, that's a fear. And so I want to tell you, there's only been one time in the history of the United States that a tax exempt status has been taken away, but it was restored the next day. So it's never happened. And if you say, okay, well, if I want to play it the safest way possible, if I want to say, okay, maybe the IRS will see me as a tax exempt entity for a 501c3 purpose, what are the safest things that I can do? So if you want to be the safest you can be, there's only a few things that the IRS will tell you they can't do. But these things on the screen, the IRS themselves would tell you these are all okay. That is registering your church members to vote. If you want to have registration at your church, you can do that. If you want to pass out voters' guides, you can do that as a church. If you have candidates that you want to call that are running for school board, that are running for mayor, and you want them to come talk to your congregation, you can do that. You can ask them to come speak. And then lastly, you can talk about specific issues. So if you want to talk about how marriage is between a man and a woman, how God believes in the sanctity of all life, so we should not endorse abortion, or how God created everyone man and female, so we cannot be for the transgender issue, you have the right to do that, and the IRS would never come after you for saying that. They'd say it's completely okay. If you want to say, what are the only things that you could ever possibly get in trouble for? It's only two things. And it's the two things of endorsing a candidate or giving church funds to a candidate. But here's what that means. That does not mean that you as the head pastor cannot say, if you as the head pastor stood up and said, I am endorsing Donald Trump for president, that's okay. That's you as your private citizen. But if you said, my church, First Baptist Allen, is saying that we endorse Donald Trump or this candidate, you can't do that. But I don't know how many of you would want to get up anyways and say that your church endorses a candidate. That doesn't seem like a very common thing to do. You could tell your church how you're voting, and that's fine. You just don't say, our church, as a group, we are endorsing this group, which you wouldn't want to do anyways. The other thing you wouldn't want to do anyways is take the tithes that are giving to your church and give that to a political candidate. You would never want to do that anyways. So that's not an issue. If you personally want to take some of your income and donate to the candidate, that is fine. You could even have a sign in your yard telling people who you're voting for. That is totally fine. So really if you want to be the safest you can be, just don't give money from your church to a candidate and don't say our church endorses this candidate. Everything else is okay. And we had a situation where there was a church that the IRS this summer has sent about 4 different letters to churches saying, hey, you allowed this person to come speak in front of your congregation, or hey, you had this message about this topic. We need you to send us your notes on that. We just send the IRS back letters every time that says, you're out of line, you have no ability to do this, you are separate from this church does not report to you, they don't have to give you any of this, you need to go away. And then every single time what happens is we get a letter back from the IRS and it says, we're withdrawing the matter. Every single time. So what this means is that you as a pastor, you can speak about any issue you want to speak on and not fear the IRS coming after you. And if they ever send you a letter, you send it to us, we'll send it to the IRS and they will back away. So this means you can be as bold as you want without fear of any type of repercussions, as long as you're just don't give church money, don't endorse as a church. That's it. Everything else is okay. So hopefully that gives you some encouragement today. Hopefully you feel like this helps me to feel like I have a little bit better of an idea of my rights.